Hi, Will Gethin here. Welcome to episode 2 of Your Blissters, the Hero's Journey podcast. In this episode, I talk with the wonderful Sarah Rozenthuler, a chartered psychologist, leadership consultant, and author of Powered by Purpose, who supports organizations to create purpose-led businesses and generate transformative change. With a diverse and colourful background of leading seminars in the business world, working with global thought leaders, and pulling crowds for street circus shows, Sarah has a sustained track record for engaging, entertaining, and educating people. In this interview, Sarah shares her fascinating story of travelling to Spain in a camper van in her early 20s and becoming an itinerant street circus performer for 4 years, before returning to integrate these skills into the corporate arena. I hope you enjoy the journey. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to the Your Blissters podcast. Thank you so much for coming all the way down from Shrewsbury today to join us here in the GFM studio in Glastonbury. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And as the author of the book Life-Changing Conversations, it feels great that we can have hopefully a conversation that will be certainly inspiring and hopefully life-inspiring, for other people. And who knows, even life-changing. And we, of course, met when I hosted you for a talk and a workshop about this particular book quite a few years ago now. And that book has a foreword by Neil Donald Walsh, the obviously very well-known author of Conversations with God. And I know Neil has referred to you as the best thing since me. And I believe he actually mentored you around that time, and I never really actually had a chance to ask you about that. So I'm interested to know how you got to know Neil and how he became to be your mentor.
Oh, thank you very much, Will, and it's lovely to be here and be having the conversation with you. And I loved the Conversations with God books, and I think I started reading them in the late 1990s. And I was a little bit slow on the uptake, to be honest, because some years after that, I went to Findhorn Eco Village to do a retreat with Neil. And it was there that I discovered he offered a teacher training program. And so that involved me going to Ashland, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
And so I went there along with a group of other students and did all the teacher training with Neil, and just came away from that even more inspired by Neil's work.
And the teacher training was teaching about how to have conversations with God, or what was the sort of the focus of the training?
It was all about, how to work with that material, that we could even say cosmology, if you like, in a way that would help make it experiential for people. And I did that for about 5 years. And part of that was then writing Life-Changing Conversations. So I went deeply into all that material and work.
And did Neil actually mentor you personally?
He did. And his willingness to write the foreword to the book was tremendous and very, very supportive. So when I was running workshops and retreats here in the UK, he would include them in his newsletter, which went out globally. So
brilliant. Wow.
He's deeply committed to spreading the messages of those books, and so was keen to help students like me.
Brilliant. That was a great support along the way, little angel hand.
Yeah.
So you have a new book out now, which is aimed at business leaders and coaches, called Powered by Purpose: How to Engage and Energize Your People Around Great Work. And we'll talk more about this book at the end, but I know that much of your work over the years is focused on helping people to follow their true calling, and in a sense to find their purpose or their heart's desire, or to sort of find their true path. And in doing so, you've been a catalyst actually for many people starting a hero or heroine's journey of some kind, as they sort of follow that call to adventure. And this call so often manifests in stories and lives as a call to follow that true path that has a real pull for an individual in their career or more generally. And it can also be a call to jump into the unknown without a clear picture of where that jump will take you, but with a sense of that need to take an adventure to follow a call for growth and change without necessarily knowing what the outcome will be. And before we jump into hearing about your own heroine's journey that you've chosen to talk about, Sarah, and your call to adventure, I'd love to just get a sense of the backgrounds of the normal world, if you like, what was going on in your life at the time this call came.
Well, you'd have to wind back the clock a good few years.
Sure.
So I would start some of the story back in the day when I was doing a psychology degree. And it's probably relevant to say that I chose to go to Nottingham University because I had a top-rated psychology department along with Oxford. But what Nottingham had that Oxford didn't was it gave the opportunity for a third-year industrial placement. And so I chose to do that. And it was an amazing opportunity because aged 19, I joined a consulting company of business psychologists. They threw me in with their graduate intake. And 6 months later, I was consulting and running programs or helping run programs on psychometric testing and so on. And so by the time I graduated, I had my degree in psychology. I had the equivalent of a postgrad in psychology plus a year's industrial experience. So in a way, I was all set up for graduate fast track. And that's kind of where the story begins in a way, because I didn't take that path.
So you got to the end of that and thought, I'm all ready to take this leap up the ladder, but maybe it's not the right ladder.
Yeah.
Or not quite the right ladder.
Well, I'd gone to university early, so I had a little bit of time, if you like, in credit, I think I felt at the time. And I just thought, having worked at this consultancy for a year, I can see where my life's going. Give me a few more years and I'm going to have the house in Surrey, a car in the drive, a good-sized mortgage. And it felt very linear and a little bit dry. And so the spirit of adventure got the better of me, and I chose, let's say, the road less travelled at that point rather than the graduate job.
Okay. So you got, in a sense, from that moment, a call to adventure, a call maybe to sort of put that on hold. How did the call come in a specific way? Was it more like just an internal sense of, okay, this is what I'm feeling now, I just need to take some time out and go and explore the unknown, or what happened?
I would say there are a few strands to it. So one was that sense of, there's got to be more to life than just doing the whole straight path. And I think my parents, who'd been wonderfully supportive and had made sure I'd got a very good education, I think that, I could feel, nothing maybe was said, but a certain pressure coming from their direction to keep on the straight and narrow. But a couple of the other things that were relevant, one was a boyfriend at the time who was 7 years older. I'd met him at Nottingham. He had been in the Royal Navy before going to university as a mature student and had travelled the 7 seas and had said to me, there's a much better life to be had than in England, much better quality of life. And so he was really up for leaving the UK.
Oh, okay.
We didn't have much money. We had very little money. The one thing we had between us, I had an old car. And so with his persuasion, I sold my old car and we bought a it wasn't even a camper van. It was a converted truck. It was more of a sort of traveller's vehicle, let's say. Mm-hmm. And that became home. And in some ways we were quite planful. It all came apart. But we did a TEFL course, a Teaching English as a Foreign Language course.
Did that in England or?
Yes, in Bournemouth. And it took a month and actually quite a lot of hard work on the back of finals. So we both got TEFL qualified and off we went in our van with the plan to drive down through France to get to Spain and to find jobs teaching English for a year. But that plan fell apart and that was the beginning of the adventure.
So why did that plan fall apart?
Because it took us about 6 weeks to get to Valencia. Mm-hmm. We stopped off in France. He worked on yachts in Antibes. So we had enough money to get to Antibes and then we saved up enough money to get to Valencia, but only just. But on the first night in Valencia, we parked in what turned out to be quite a dodgy part of town and the van got burgled.
What, the very first night?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So we pretty much lost everything. And then 2 nights later had another, the van was broken into again, foreign number plates. Wow. So we lost everything.
That's really bad luck, isn't it?
Yeah.
Has Valencia got a reputation for being, or did it have for being
that
a
part
criminal?
Of town did, yes.
Yeah.
But, in our naivety, we didn't know that. We had friends from Nottingham were there having a good life. And so we were left with no money, no clothes other than pretty much what we were stood up wearing, no everything went. So it was, what do you do then? My choice was I could phone my parents, reverse charges, and they would have wired me out some money, but I figured that would have been conditional on filling the tank with diesel and coming back to the UK and doing the straight and narrow. Or it was a case of getting resourceful pretty quickly just to keep surviving.
Okay, so what did you do to survive?
Well, by this time I'd met a good number of travellers, as they would call themselves, or Thatcher's refugees if they were British. And
what year are we in out of interest? Sort of.
Oh gosh!
Let me guess, about 1992 or something.
Yeah, 93, 94. Right. This would be.
Okay.
Yeah. And I met a whole host of people, from scallywags and drug dealers through to incredibly creative, talented musicians and artisans and street performers. And so we met a group of jugglers and so on, about 7 of them, and it began by just passing the hat, bottling it was known. So if you didn't have any skills, you could actually learn to smile and pass the hat, and then you'd get a portion of the takings. And that crucially gave a little bit of cash flow. And that's what kept us in Spain.
Wow. So, I mean, I've always been fascinated by it to hear that you sort of fell into this sort of street circus life in Spain for a number of years. So it's interesting to hear how it actually came about. But would you have ever even imagined when you left England that that's what you end up doing in Spain? Probably not.
I would never have imagined it. And if you'd have shown me a little clip of how life would have been a few months later, I would never have taken the deal, so to speak. But when you spoke in the introduction about that step into the unknown and not knowing what the outcome would be, I can really relate to that. And it was very humbling. I remember meeting a German guy. He was 14. He'd been brought up on the road. Both mum and dad were travellers. And he was very talented at doing, I don't know if you know what a Diablo is, one of these, it's shaped like an egg.
It's the devil, doesn't it?
It does, in Spanish it does. It's shaped like an egg timer. You throw it up high, you catch it on a string between 2 sticks.
Okay, I know,
You'll see it in
I didn't know it
Chinese
was called
State
that.
Circus. He was very, very good at that. And I used to watch him go out and busk during siesta and come back with a hat full of money. And I used to think, gosh, there you are at 14 and you can do all that and survive. And here I am at 21 with all these university certificates and bits of paper and A-levels and O and all the rest of it. And you can make a living and I can't. And it was like, it was a real, I don't know, thump, sort of just landing on the earth with a big thump and thinking about, well, what are my skills and how do you survive? So it was a very humbling time.
I was meaning to ask you, now I think about it, but at the point in the hero's journey, or the heroine's journey in your case, when the sort of adventure starts and there's a commitment to the journey, there's a crossing of the threshold, which in your case may have been the flight to Spain, or perhaps it was actually more stepping into this new world of street theatre. But anyway, the crossing is often sort of accompanied either just before or soon after by the appearance of some kind of mentor figure who sort of helps and assists in some way, or shares some wisdom, or perhaps gives some gifts or something, or some skill to share. And perhaps this character, I don't know, may have been a mentor of sorts to you, showing you the way or giving you inspiration.
Yes. Well, actually, who comes to mind? They're actually a family. It's a family that comes to mind. So mum, dad, and 2 boys, British family.
Yeah.
Who had been living in Kent, and dad was a carpenter, and And they had lived in a vehicle in Kent. And you might remember during that time, things had become very difficult for the sort of new age travellers, they were called.
Yeah.
And so there was quite an exodus from the UK. They'd lived in France for many years and had then gone to Spain. And I just found them incredibly inspiring because they were so resourceful. So they made marionettes, little wooden puppets and jesters' hats, and did little kind of impromptu market stalls. And I think I used to look at them and think, my goodness, if they can survive with an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old as well, then surely this living on the road, being resourceful can work. And so we parked up with them actually on and off for the next 3 years or so. And they were incredibly generous about sharing what they knew about living on the road and how to live on a shoestring, really.
So you literally like lived this sort of traveling itinerant lifestyle, sort of following this family around with the boyfriend still?
For about 3 years.
Right.
Yeah. And then the relationship came to an end. That was my decision. And then I stayed in Spain for another year. And by that stage, I had learned to juggle and do the Diablo. And I learned how to juggle fire and knives. And I sort of put together a little street show. And I had one, you could say, good.
Were you loving all that? Were you just sort of completely, I'm sure it's hard as well, but were you loving this sort of creativity of learning new skills and doing all these wacky things?
I think what I loved most, and this is picking back up on the psychology, is I loved the psychology of street shows. And I did have another mentor along the way who was an American magician who had worked the streets for 20 years. And I first saw him in Pamplona in the big fiesta where they run the bulls through the streets. So it's a real magnet for lots of street performers. And I'd seen him in a really huge, busy plaza walk in, put his top hat down, gather together a crowd of kids doing some simple magic tricks. And then about 10 minutes later, he had an enormous crowd. And this random street scene had turned into a circle where people were clapping together and laughing together. And I watched the whole thing unfold, including him picking up his big top hat at the end and it getting absolutely full of coins and paper money. And I just thought, that's magic. Like, how do you do that? Not so much from the point of view of technical skill, but process.
Yeah.
And how do you create
or engage an audience and get that kind of captivation?
Yeah, and create a sort of field of coherence in a random street scene. And it was, looking back, it was that really captivated me. And so technically, I was never that brilliant as a juggler, and I'm not to this day. But what I was interested in and what I did get to grips with were the process skills of pulling a crowd, holding a crowd, entertaining a crowd, and then passing the hat.
Wow. So did you have some big crowds?
I did sometimes. I mean, on a good night, I would go out. I'd learned how to pick my pitch. I could go out. On a very good night, I could do 5 shows. The magician taught me a number of things, but the crucial thing would be how to pick the volunteer for your show. So his top tip to me was, get a volunteer involved and you'll double the money in your hat. But there's a certain art to picking the volunteer.
Okay.
So I learned all that, and I did.
So what's the art to getting the right volunteer?
Oh, you need to pick somebody with whom you've had eye contact, somebody who's smiling and looks as though they're enjoying themselves. And somebody, I'd always pick a chap because I'd juggle knives over the top of him, and it was always a bit more comical with a man on the ground. So I'd pick a man typically that also had his partner with him. So he had some support in the audience still when he stepped into the circle. And the better dressed he was, the better it seemed to work as well. I was all dressed up as a jester with a big pointy hat and face paints on and literally bells on my fingers and toes. And so it was probably the contrast between him, hopefully in a suit and tie, and me looking slightly bizarre, that created a comic effect for people.
Gosh, it's interesting, isn't it? Sort of these things, as a spectator, you never really think about all the sort of processes and little tricks that have gone into making a show work in the way it does. Like, so many times I've seen a performer of some kind call a volunteer up, but you haven't thought about how they're thinking about that volunteer and why they're choosing them. Or fascinating. So this stage of the hero's journey is about sort of building up skills and resources, which obviously you were, and you were building this amazing solo show. It's about the tests and challenges, and we've also had the challenges with the van and being broken into. And were there any other key challenges sort of at this stage, kind of that were really challenged you along the way with this lifestyle? Was it sort of making ends meet, or?
I mean, there was all the challenge around just, quite frankly, being very poor for a number of years. I think there was a challenge around the sheer pace of change and rate of change. So in summer season, you might, in some weeks, be in a different town every day. So just getting used to waking up in a different scene every day. So lots of need to be very adaptable. And I think the other challenge I would mention is that most, not all, but the vast majority of other street performers I met were all guys. Yeah. So being a woman out there, in some ways was quite tough. I didn't meet that many other women doing this. It maybe worked to my advantage as well because it was unusual. So maybe that helped. And I was also helped, and it's worth, I think, acknowledging it, that when I did my solo show, I also worked with a drummer. So he would play the bongo, and actually that really helped draw the crowd. So although I was doing all the visual performance solo, I did have a drummer in the background who was really helpful, and I think provided a certain sense.
They go, oh, what are those beats? And then come over and go, oh, what's this show?
Yeah, it was an integral part of the show.
And the stage is also about building alliances and support. And were there any sort of crucial or interesting sort of allies that appeared and sort of helped to, well, your drummer for one? But,
yeah, there was the drummer. I think the big one in a way was, well, there were all the other performers that I met, and there was real camaraderie between them. And you'd pitch up you'd go from, I don't know, Pamplona to San Sebastian, and you'd often see some of the same crowd. And there was a real sense of it being a fluid community. And I really liked that. And I think the really big help was the magician, who sadly I found out because I wrote about him in Life-Changing Conversations, and that whole thing about get a volunteer and you'll double the money in a hat. Because if you, and I know we'll come on to it, but working in the corporate world, if you really engage and energize people feel involved, it makes a real difference. So I really wanted to acknowledge him. And yes, anyway, he died a couple of years ago. He had moved out to Thailand, but he really, meeting him, turned me from being a juggler on the side of the street with my hat on the ground, going tap, tap, tap with my juggling clubs for an hour or two, into a sort of somebody who, it took me a season or two to get there, learn how to do shows. And it was a completely different way of being on the street, and also economically it made a real difference being able to do shows rather than, as it's known in the busking world, doing time.
Well, it sounds like an incredible way to spend your early 20s. What a sort of fantastic vibrant sort of way of life to have lived, and I guess also great training ground for your future work as a sort of corporate busker of sorts.
Not that I knew it at the time, and there were some real twists and turns along the way. But
learning the skills of how to captivate an audience and to engage and energize people.
Yeah. And I look back now with 2020 hindsight, and I think what an amazing apprenticeship.
Yeah, really.
But
really
actually, maybe we'll come on to this next. There was quite a crash at the end of 4 years of doing all that mad adventure in Spain.
Before you got to the crash, out of interest, were you living off your earnings and making a sort of enough to kind of get by.
Yeah, absolutely. And just had a very simple lifestyle, very few overheads. And actually...
But probably at that age, is, happy to sort of live that sort of flowing with, just what's available and hand to mouth and the excitement of living the street life for a while.
Absolutely. And in Spain, you've got the good weather and you're outside, and we were parked up in orange orchards, and life was good without needing hardly anything at all materially. So,
and all these new experiences and new people to meet. And
learning a new language. So it was a very, very rich time. Tough, but very rich. Yeah.
Well, that's all the grist for the hero's journey, isn't it? So the rough with the smooth, and all the more sort of, well, if we'll come on to the title of the podcast, but follow your bliss or follow your blisters, as Campbell later amended his quote or his mantra for living. The more one embraces the difficulties in life and the hardships and the tough things, rather than avoiding them, that the richer and actually more blissful in a way life can also be.
Yeah.
When one goes with the flow with that. The good years in Spain, tough but good, rolled by, and then, as you were about to say, you came to sort of a point of a bit of a crash. What happened then?
Well, it was all rather unexpected, really. I'd had one good summer season doing the solo show, or the show with the drummer. I'd actually stashed enough cash to be able to get through a whole winter. Living, and the plan was actually to go and live in an abandoned mountain village where other traveller friends had settled up in the mountains near Teruel, and I got permission from the owners to move into a house, and it had a tap and it had roses growing around the front door, and I thought, God, this is a whole new chapter now, so no longer in the van and the truck, but I'll settle for a...
It's quite hard wondering as you're talking, like, I'm wondering how you'd have looked then, like sort of, what are we, sort of 20 odd years ago, however long ago it was.
Yeah.
Would you look very different? Would you have been, when you weren't on stage, sort of, was your whole appearance? I can imagine this sort of rather sort of wild, young, sort of ragaband, sort of artist type, with sort of lots of piercings and tattoos almost, but you haven't got any tattoos. But
no,
or at least I've seen.
It's a good question. I had a very subtle, I had a nose piercing, but not a big thing. But that was the only thing. And I remember talking with a girlfriend. So she and I met on the road in Spain, and we're friends to this day. Yeah. And she's also back in the UK. And I just share briefly, but before she lived on the road, she had long dreadlocks, I think, and multicoloured dyed hair and all the rest of it. And I remember her reflecting to me that actually once she was living on the road, because the lifestyle itself was so alternative, there was no need to make a statement about it in terms of how one looked. So in all honesty, I probably didn't look that different than I do today, apart from the single nose piercing.
So you saved that for the dressing up. Yeah. when you were on stage, on street, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I always, whenever I busked, I dressed in a costume because I think that really helped me. Yeah. And other than that, I mean, what I would say is that most of my clothes were, slightly odd phrase, we used to talk about tatting. Which is when you go to rubbish dumps and you'd pick through the rubbish.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So most of our clothes were tatted. Because
so not the well-dressed lady I see in front of me today.
No, dungarees and old T-shirts and denim shorts. But again, in Spain, hey, you didn't need a whole wardrobe. Yes. Yeah.
What was the sort of turning point to you kind of leaving that you were about to tell me when you were...
Well, I thought, having lined up this house, that this was the beginning of the next chapter, and with the money stash, I wouldn't have to work the winter. And that, in a way, was the definition of success.
Under your pillow.
Yeah. And I'd managed it this one season. And I moved into this house and just went into a really dark place emotionally, and sort of went to bed crying and would wake up crying. And I don't think I was clinically depressed, but it was the darkest place I've been in.
Whatever.
Yeah, I would say so. And on the back of that, I spoke to my mum on the phone and she said, well, why don't you come back to the UK for a week or so and just reflect on things? So I took a flight, I came back, I stayed at my parents' house. And it turned out that I had a life-changing conversation with my mum. And what she said to me was very simple. She said to me, well, you're not fulfilled because you're not using all your talents. And I went away and I had a real long think about that. And I thought, well, I do love doing street shows and I love making kids laugh and I love helping adults, relax and have a good time. But I'm not using my knowledge of psychology or...
I'm guessing presumably that while you were in Spain living this lifestyle, you weren't thinking this is like what I'm doing now. You were presumably thinking this is just something I'm doing for as long as it feels good, or...
I wasn't clear, to be honest. What I did know is that I loved Spain as a country.
Yeah.
I loved the climate.
Yeah.
I was starting to get to grips with the language. I loved Spanish people, the Latin culture. Yeah. And I also liked the alternative life.
Yeah.
So I think there was part of me that thought, I will maybe stay here. But it wasn't to be, because being in that dark place and having that conversation with my mum led me to reflect, and the upshot of that was that I just left it all behind. I went back to Spain and then made the move back to England on what turned out to be a more permanent basis.
So you went back to where? Did you get back to mum and dad's, or? Yeah,
I did. I went back to mum and dad's, and that stash of cash that would have got me through a whole winter in Spain and felt quite abundant back in the UK was quite a paltry.
So first night in the pub.
Quite a paltry amount. So, I was very fortunate in that I could move back in with mum and dad.
Yeah.
And it turns out I was there for over a year, and it took me a year, if I'm honest, just to get my head around life again in a much more conventional, straight setting.
Yeah, of course.
I had an enormous resistance to writing my CV. It took me months to even begin the task, because whilst you and I, can sit here and I can talk about, how abundant and rich the years in Spain were, the thought of having to account for myself in a recruitment setting just filled me with dread and horror. And part of being in that dark place...
I'm sure if you spun it the right way, they'd probably have been quite impressed.
Well, it's...
Even though you'd think, oh my God, I think I've been on some sort of road trip for 5 years, but yeah.
It's a strange thing, because decades later, it's the one thing that I'm invariably asked about. But at age 26... But that point you to prove that you were more than just a sort of street circus artist who would actually settle down and do good work. Yeah. And I just sat there and thought, in my mid-20s, I've burnt all my bridges. What on earth was, I'd graduated with flying colours and I had the, work experience. And I just thought, in my low place, I've just thrown the whole lot away. I felt a bit like the prodigal daughter who'd, been given a great inheritance and kind of not quite, gone and, in a way kind of gone and thrown it all away. And when I came back, I had contemporaries who had been on the psychology course at Nottingham with me, who had started, who'd done the sensible thing.
Years ahead on their careers.
Yeah. So it was a difficult time.
So you came back sort of dark, disillusioned, kind of went into, in a sense, the dark wood of the hero's or heroine's journey. And at that point of the journey, as the character or protagonist, or in this case you and your life story, normally comes sort of face to face with their sort of greatest fear or obstacle that stands in the way of them moving forward on this journey. So what would you say the sort of biggest obstacle or fear that faced you that you needed to overcome to move forward at this point, to get you out of that dark wood?
I think it was that fear around, I've thrown it all away. Psychology as a degree subject by this time had become the most popular of all the degree subjects. So I was thinking, I remember frightening myself reading, I don't know whether it was 2,000 psychology graduates a year. And I thought, well, who's going to want to give me a job when my degree's 5 years old and I've got this sort of random 4 years to account for as well. So Yeah, I think that was the big obstacle for me.
Feel that you've blown the chance of a professional career.
Yeah. And there's loads of competition out there, and yeah, I think that was the big one.
Okay, and the stage is also about a sort of a time of death and rebirth. Sort of the shamanic territory, as Christopher Vogler, the author of The Writer's Journey, calls it. Would you say there's a part of you that needed to die at that point, symbolically in some way, in able to move forward?
I do, and I think, and it didn't really become clear to me until I was back in the UK that I'd actually become very attached to an identity of I'm a traveller. And amongst the travelling community, there was a real pride in that, and there was a real sense of like, we're kind of off the grid and we live on the edges, and we're not in mainstream, so we're travellers, and and along with I think a certain pride, maybe there was some ego attached to that. And I remember being back at mum and dad's house without a job, without really any money, and just thinking, well, who am I? I've got no identity, and I can't call myself a traveller anymore because I'm just, back in my hometown under my parents' roof. And so there was a certain, I think, letting go at a sort of deep identity level was the death, really. And it was a painful process. I only saw the attachment to the identity, as I say, sort of retrospectively.
Have you ever since, out of interest, sort of thought, oh gosh, I wish I could go back to being that girl travelling on the road and being that sort of adventurous youth?
No, because life, whatever it now is, 20 years on, actually, maybe we'll come to this, in a different way, still feels like a real adventure.
Yeah.
So there's no, and I must admit, I'm just so grateful because it was so hand to mouth. It literally was a case that if I didn't go out and busk that evening, I wouldn't get to the supermarket the next day. So it was literally, the pressure was on. And to this day, I am so grateful that, there's food in the fridge, there's food in the cupboard. They were amazing years, and I wouldn't choose to live hand to mouth again, if I'm honest.
So how did you sort of move through or move on? So you had to write that CV?
Yeah.
And eventually, presumably, got a job. Was that sort of the big sort of step forward again to the next phase of the life?
Yeah, although in a way it was quite, as it turned out, it was quite a gentle step. I actually contacted one of my old professors from Nottingham, who he'd supervised my final year thesis, and he was at Goldsmiths in London. And I think I wrote him a letter. I think this was pre-email. And he wrote back to me. And he said to me, come to London, buy me a cup of coffee and a slice of chocolate cake, and I'll give you some careers advice. So I did. I caught the train to London. I went to see him. We had our cup of tea and slice of cake. And it was a crucial thing, actually, because he connected me with a Goldsmith psychology graduate who was working for what is now Job Centre Plus, and at the time was the Employment Service. And he was looking for recent psychology graduates who were willing to travel around the UK to different job centres to administer trial selection tests, gather data, and they were gathering data to make sure the tests didn't have an adverse impact on women or candidates from an ethnic minority background. And so, in a way, it was quite low-level work. It was quite administrative. And so I went for a selection day in a town hall in southeast London, and I got through that. And so I was given this sort of big suitcase full of psychometric tests, and my first assignment was to go to Wigan. So I drove up the night before, And I'll never forget it because it was November, the rain was lashing down. I parked the car in a car park. I got this big heavy case out. And I just remember standing there thinking, what on earth am I doing now? Having loved the Mediterranean life so much, I just thought, really?
You thought it's grim up north.
Yeah, but actually, the real blessing was that they were a really good crowd, the other psychologists, and I got on really, and funnily enough, there were two chaps in the office who knew how to juggle. So I took my juggling balls in, and we'd have these juggling sessions at the end of the working day sometimes. Anyway, I somehow found my feet, really enjoyed getting to know these colleagues. And a few months later, or maybe a year later, the casual contract turned into a more permanent contract. The part-time work turned into full-time work. I then got offered a job, a permanent position as a psychologist in Sheffield at head office of the employment service. And it just reinvigorated me, and I realised that I had a real love of applying psychology in the workplace, which is what I'd done during the industrial placement year. And slowly but surely, all the lights inside me started to sort of shine again.
Come alive again.
Yeah.
So having sort of been in that dark wood and that place of real disorientation, that's normally followed by this opportunity for a sort of silver lining, and particularly with a sort of heroine's journey. So, what do you think the sort of the treasure, the gift was for you out of that dark wood, out of this journey?
Gosh, there'd be many things. By the time I was 30, I'd got chartered as a psychologist, and I think I was really determined to sort of not quite make good, but have something tangible, having had these sort of rather crazy years. And I think, well, maybe we'll come on to the whole thing about writing. And I sometimes look back and think, I don't know if I'd have gone for the more conventional career path, would I have done the writing that I've done, and the kind of the soul searching, I suppose, and the spiritual questing that I've done, because I think it is those, I mean, it sounds almost cliche, but I think it is being in the dark woods that makes us reach inside ourselves for deeper resources.
Yeah.
So that would be definitely some of the harvest. And I think the other thing is that I look back now, and I've been self-employed for about, nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I would have cut it being self-employed if I hadn't have had those years on the road where I'd got used to loads of financial instability and just that high degree of change.
Yeah.
And so I continually harvest that experience in ways that I could never have anticipated.
As well as, of course, bringing in your sort of showgirl, sort of your performer, sort of engaging the crowds, which you've done in the corporate world, but having learnt that in Spain.
Yeah, it's very relevant because the core work I do these days is coaching leadership teams, and that could be anything from a group of 8 to 25. Some teams are quite big. Sometimes I've worked with groups of 60 people. And I think you used the phrase earlier, corporate busker. And there are times when I do feel like that, because I've kind of got to go in, sort of almost set out my stall, engage people quite quick, not for 15 minutes. Sometimes I'm with a team for 2 days, but actually on an energetic level, knowing how to create a container, or an environment where people's energies are gathered together and there's a sense of coherence in the room. And in that coherent energy field, a team can think together well and they can talk together. It's those years learning how to do the busking actually have played a really important part in that. And I just never could have anticipated that.
On the on the heroine's journey, in your case, the heroine brings something back to share for the community back home, and in your case, I guess that was the corporate community. Well, I think both, because you've also brought something back for your, you have this sort of spiritual, your book Life Changing Conversations was published by Hay House, and some of your work has been more mind, body, spirit, general focused, more spiritual sort of self-development, sharing wisdom for helping people to sort of transform their lives in that sort of way, as well as in the corporate arena, helping companies and individuals in companies to engage more skillfully and to live more, or to engage more purposely in the office, or have a more purposeful organisation. What was the boon you felt you brought back, or have we just covered that with the?
I think there's been a thread around what's meaningful, actually, looking back. And I should mention that Life Changing Conversations came out as a second edition a year or so ago, and it had a new title, which is How to Have Meaningful Conversations. Watkins with the publisher.
Oh, right. Okay. That's interesting, because when I was just sort of researching the interview, I had in my notes 2 titles. I think, so I Googled to see which one was right, and the Amazon one was Life Changing Conversations.
Yeah, it's still there on Amazon.
So it wasn't a mistake, okay.
But both titles appear,
right.
But the new print version is How to Have Meaningful Conversations. And I think because of the dark wood experience, where my own life actually felt quite meaningless towards the end of that time busking, I think it really switched me on to the difference it makes when we do things that feel meaningful to us. And that's very individual, and it could be different for every single person. And so the latest book, Powered by Purpose, is very much about how do we make work feel meaningful for people, so that they're truly energized, so that they follow their bliss in the workplace. So the thread, and I think the boon, or if I'm offering something to the people I work with, it would be around what's meaningful, what's engaging, what's energizing. Yeah.
So when you're helping people to work out what's meaningful, and energizing, and engaging, how do you tend to work today in organisations and things? What's the sort of main structure of your work, or how do you work?
Yeah, so it's often with leadership teams, sometimes with individual leaders and coaching them. The work I most enjoy would be in a team setting. Again, it's the group thing, it's the collective. And I really like it when there's a team and they're struggling to talk about this, or there's an elephant in the room, and how to go in and help create the conditions where it becomes safe enough to talk about the things that are tricky. And so what's really fulfilling for me is to come away from a couple of days with a team and just have a sense that they've had a dialogue that they might not have had otherwise. And in talking together, they've sort of really started to pull together as a team. And the purpose plays a role in that, because increasingly what I'm doing with teams is looking at what their team purpose is, or what the purpose of the organisation is. And you may well be aware, and listeners may well be aware, there is this whole growing movement happening in the business world around purpose-driven business. And I'm increasingly seeing my work as fitting into part of that bigger movement.
And also, under the sort of banner of purpose, you're really sort of encouraging or inspiring leaders and their teams, their employees, to be sort of lit up and to feel alive and to find their purpose. And I'm struck by the sort of similarity with that, in a sense, with Joseph Campbell's invitation to follow your bliss, or blisters, should we want to go in that direction. But and I've had a chance to have a look at your new book, which I've been really enjoying. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Got lucky to get an early copy. I was struck by, you mentioned a business leader who was sort of come to a point where he's feeling quite de-energized in his life. I think he'd been an engineer and he was a bit stuck and feeling his mojo gone, and you helped him to really find his passion. And he said to you, "You're helping leaders to switch the lights back on inside." And that struck me that it's very similar to Campbell's invitation to follow your bliss. And do you think it's the same thing in a sense, or what would be the difference?
I think it's very similar. I think if I had to update, if I could be so bold as to update Campbell slightly, I might say kind of follow your flow. Because you might well be aware there's a whole wonderful body of work in psychology around being in the zone, or flow is this state of optimal experience. And it speaks to me because sometimes when I think about bliss, I think of myself on a mountaintop, or in a radiant state meditating. And again, it's probably the psychologist in me. I'm just very clear with flow. It's that state where we're very actively engaged and there's a sense of being stretched. So we're not going to go into flow watching TV or even a great movie, actually. That's pleasurable. But we need this active engagement to follow our flow. And so I think that's some of what I'm trying to do in the work I do with people. Or working with a team. How can we have a dialogue where, if I just completely jump context for a moment, but in a Quaker meeting, you might know they talk about when the meeting gathers. So energetically something happens in the room and there's that sense of like everybody is engaged. And that's what I'm looking to do in my work with teams. So there's that sense of the whole team being in flow. And in that state, people can really do their best thinking and they can come up with innovative solutions. And I find it very, very energizing to do that. And I just think leaders and leadership teams, they impact so many other people's lives that if we can get the quality of dialogue and decision making better, amongst leaders, that the ripple effect of that on other people's well-being can be tremendous. And I find that very exciting.
It sounds quite a job to get everybody sort of, individually flowing and then flowing together.
It's a process.
I'm sure it must be really exciting when it seems to suddenly sort of all gel together and flow. At that kind of collective level in the organisation or in the team.
And I mean, during lockdown, I had the experience of learning how to do that online and in the context of a Zoom meeting. And these things are possible. They're absolutely possible, with a certain degree of slowing down. And when people get really present, when there's some presence in the conversation, it really helps.
It's a fascinating thing, actually, flow, isn't it? I've often sort of wanted to find the right book on it. I remember being at a Neil Young gig about 3 years ago, and towards the end, all the musicians were on stage, and they were all like sort of jamming in together, playing the guitars. It went into something very sort of spontaneous, and like they were all just reading each other in the moment, and all just creating this magic. It was off, it wasn't even a song. It was just off piece, as it were, and it was all just flowing, and this incredible sort of magic came out of it. And you go, wow, how does one get to that state? That flow state. And
we can feel it when we're in it ourselves. And I think that's a great example when we're in the room and you've got jazz musicians and they're truly present and they're jamming and riffing, and it's magical. And that, I think, that's the follow your flow, which I think it maybe is saying the same thing as follow your bliss, with the emphasis.
Well, I've certainly heard or read Campbell saying somewhere that in terms of clues to following your bliss, when are you flowing? When you feel in the flow, then that's a clue to your bliss.
And I love the follow your blisters part as well, because that's got the hint of that sense of being stretched and of growth, and there might be a need to kind of persevere as well.
Well, absolutely. I think you kind of naively think, oh, I go off and follow this bliss and this, this chart. It's got to be a winning thing. It's going to go in the right direction. And well, certainly when you're younger and you're learning, like certainly in my experience, you head off after this sort of horizon excitedly, and by going towards that thing that really is that pulse that's really pulling you, that feels like the bliss, you will invite the biggest sort of challenges, really.
Absolutely.
And you grow for those challenges, and the bliss becomes hard won, and all the more stronger and more meaningful and more glorious for that, really. Yeah.
That's it. And I think, I'm sure you're very familiar.
And coming and going at different points, it's not going to stay that way. It's just, you have to go through these troughs and these difficult times.
That's it. It's not 100% bliss all the time. And I've been influenced by Nick Williams's work, who wrote The Work You Were Born to Do.
Yeah.
And Nick is very articulate about when we actually get on our true path in life, our resistance will come up. It's like there's a double pull. We feel both pulled towards it.
Yes.
And I think because deep down and instinctively we sense that there are going to be challenges and stretches, we also want to pull away from it. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because if resistance is coming up, it's not a negative sign.
I've had a conversation with Nick before where I asked his advice about going towards a project, and he was feeling my strong resistance to it. Said, well, you need to do it.
Right, there you go. Yes, yeah.
Follow that resistance.
Yeah, he's very clear on this.
Follow your bliss, follow your resistance.
Yeah,
they seem very different, don't they? But actually, it is the same. Can be the same thing.
Yeah.
So, do you feel you're living in your flow today with your work? If we use that word?
Oh, yes, I do. Absolutely, I do. I feel right on track. And, and on this last point, there are plenty of challenges, and, I sometimes have to, like with the writing, it took me well over 3 years to write Powered by Purpose.
Did it? Yeah.
Yeah, and there were days where I really had to discipline myself to get to my writing desk and, get 500 words written. And it didn't always feel like it was flowing. But what I've generally learned is actually by sort of just getting there, then it will always turn into something that feels more easeful, actually.
Yeah.
But it's
still got to go through those rough, difficult moments where it's not flowing.
Yeah, they're part of it. Yeah.
And you highlight in your book that 6% of people in the UK don't want to return to a pre-pandemic economy. That there's a shift of people now wanting a sort of fairer, greener economy, and businesses focus not just on profit for profit's sake. And supporting the well-being of people and planet. And do you think, therefore, that this, now at this time of COVID, if you like, and environmental meltdown and Black Lives Matter as well, so creating big shifts, do you think, in a sense, purpose is really, its time has really come now?
That would be my best hope. I think increasingly there are questions around, why do we exist, as a business, as an organisation, what are we here for? I also want to acknowledge that plenty of businesses and people, are also just in survival mode. And so I know that there are some people that would just kind of throw the purpose question out of the window, and can be actually quite cynical about purpose. And I think if purpose isn't authentically lived, so just as people talk about greenwash, people will talk about purpose wash. And I really get that criticism. And I think that, for purpose to the organisations, because what's exciting now is that there's a strong business case. And so there are purpose-driven organisations that have got really solid financial results. And so I think that's really helping purpose sort of receive more attention.
You can be in service in some way and still maintain a commercial
Absolutely.
business. Still meet the bottom line.
Yeah. And there's the whole, and again, you probably know this, there's a whole movement around ESG investors, so environmental, social and governance credentials are being paid much more close attention. And there's a growing body of evidence that's saying it's companies with strong ESG credentials that the investors want to invest in. And crucially, younger investors as well. So millennials are increasingly having decision-making power. So I think this whole landscape around work and business is really, really on the move. And that's been quickened and catalysed by the COVID situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it feels like there's been this sort of talk about a kind of social, spiritual revolution for so many years, and it sort of has been kind of gradually sort of moving forward and shifting and changing for quite a few years now, but suddenly it feels like it's gone into real shake-up time. That things can really really move forward now, including in the business world. That's also really catching up. Can really sort of catapult forwards potentially.
And I think there's a real appetite as well for leaders leading in a different way. So I think there's increasingly less tolerance for, let's call it, the strong man model of leadership, or very authoritarian models of leadership, whether that's in the corporate setting and the political setting. There's more critiquing of that. There's more awareness of it. I think there's a whole shift in how particularly young people want to be led as well. So there's pressure for change happening in multiple directions.
Sort of less hierarchical, less top-down, more collaborative. Working together, giving everyone a chance to have a voice. And when you start out with a new corporate client, helping them discover their purpose and coaching them through the challenges of turning their organisation into a purpose-driven business, in essence, one could say you're sparking them and guiding them on a hero or heroine's journey, where there's a call to grow and to change, to sort of have a purpose that's meaningful, that stretches the organisation in that way. And ending with them bringing something back for the community in terms of what that is generating as a sort of force for good. Would you say that could be applicable?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the hero's journey, the heroine's journey as a blueprint. You could use that to look at the journey of an organisation and what the boon is. And, often there does need to be acknowledgement of challenges, difficulties, if certain people or groups have felt excluded, then that needs to be acknowledged. There needs to be some inclusion again. There needs to be a movement towards people feeling a place of belonging in order for the whole organisation or team to go on that journey. So I can see many, many parallels. Yeah,
and you could also say that we're on a collective hero or heroine's journey now, and that we're right in the dark wood.
Yes, that's where I would put us.
What can readers of Powered by Purpose, do you think, get from reading Powered by Purpose, your new book, that they wouldn't get from another book about purposeful business?
Well, the book is very practically focused. So I think in every chapter there's some exercise or tool for really applying so for example, there's a chapter on leadership presence. There's a chapter on authentic dialogue, but it's really rooted in, so what could you do as a leader using, these tools, this framework? And I think overall what you've got, I talk in the book about the 3 bridges of purpose. So purpose at an individual level, a team level, and an organisational level. Is
that why your company's called Bridgework?
In part, yeah. I've always liked the bridge. It's partly because I'm from Shrewsbury, the town, which is surrounded by the River Severn. So there are all these bridges. And as a child, I always just loved this notion of the bridge being, it helps us cross a threshold. Back to our heroic journey. And so I think what's different about Powered by Purpose is it actually works with purpose more systemically, and then potentially more at scale, because there are many books about individual purpose and following your North Star, for example. Then there are a number of books about organisational purpose, and they'll be looking at the Unilever and the Patagonia and Salesforce and other organisations. There's very few books that cover looking at the team as a unit of change in an organisation. And I don't think any book quite puts the three together and gives a set of integrated steps, which is what I've tried to do in Powered by Purpose, and just unpack the way that leadership needs to change if work is going to be truly meaningful and engaging for people.
So who would you recommend, like, as well as this is a book for obviously leaders, it's a book for coaches who work with corporate organizations and their teams. It's presumably also a book for the people in those teams and people working in businesses that want to find a way maybe to inspire their own businesses they're working within to be more purposeful and more engaging with their staff and their own sort of drives and flow. Is there anyone else who should be reading this book?
I'd say, adding to that, I'm aware that's a long list already, but I think younger people, so millennials.
People who might be moving into work and thinking about the kind of organisations they want to work with and how they want them to work. And that you know, I think they're actually expressing more fully and more easily that natural desire we all have to want to make a difference. And the final group of readers I would point to potentially are women leaders, because I do in the book say that I think there's increasing frustration with macho styles of leadership, which women can also demonstrate. Yes.
But I do some work around women's leadership and just that more, as you were describing it, more collaborative, more distributed leadership where the human connection and the human relationship is absolutely central. I think many women would have an affinity with that as well. So I would include them specifically too.
Okay, brilliant. And just talking about that sort of macho male thing, it just reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you, because I know you're a fan of Maureen Murdoch and her book, The Heroine's Journey. And Maureen obviously argues or puts the case that that Campbell's sort of hero's journey, if you like, was too limited and it didn't include the sort of psycho-spiritual journey of women enough. And as I understand it, I think that the general sort of structure of it is that the woman goes on some sort of journey that involves her maybe abandoning some of her femininity and embracing sort of trying to succeed maybe more in the man's world and take on, you know, the traditionally sort of more male qualities, thinking she's got to survive in a man's world. But then at the end of having become successful in that venture, starts to feel empty and wonder what happened. And then starts to slowly reintegrate with the feminine again, and ultimately has to find that balance between male and female parts of herself to feel whole and complete. That journey, has that resonated much for you in your journey through the corporate world and finding your place within it and how you can feel it in harmony?
Yes, it does resonate. And I think ultimately it's about a real fusion of what we might typically think of as masculine or more feminine traits. So I think it is about being, you know, decisive and collaborative. It's about being really firm sometimes and also really kind, you know, and we don't necessarily have to put a gender lens on those. I think some people sometimes find that unhelpful, but I think there is something about this more balanced and integrated approach that is really, really, really valuable. And what I love in Maureen Murdoch's work as well is her emphasis on that it's really also about the inner quest. So when we were talking about difficulties and, you know, kind of slaying the dragons, many of our biggest demons are these internal ones.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, the inner gremlins, and, you know, I think our biggest demons are, they're to do with our inner dialogue and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so I've really appreciated the way that she's underlined the inner aspect of the journey as well as the outer aspect. Well,
certainly as a male, I've definitely been through a strong hero's journey where I've also had to encounter those parts of myself and the shadow aspects of myself and go into the underworld.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it can be the same for men and women. But and obviously in Campbell's original model, so many of the traditional heroes were male. So it tends to be much more focused on the sort of the male and the external battle, maybe at the expense of that inner journey. But I think in essence, I feel it's kind of, the way I see it or have experienced it anyway, it's both. It's sort of the same thing.
Yeah. And maybe the final thing I might add to that, sitting in a woman's body as I do, is just a real appreciation of like life moves in cycles, and our body, certainly women's bodies go in cycles, So I just think with the hero's journey, we, that arc that you and I have been exploring, we can go through that many times. We can cycle around that, and there can be longer arcs and shorter arcs, and
we have to go back round again because we haven't quite learned the lessons fully of the last one.
And that whole,
or we haven't actually come back with something to share and share that. So the journey has been about giving something to other people, rather than just making it for ourselves, and then we're forced to get around again because we haven't really got that message. That can happen too. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Really fascinating to hear your story and how you've managed to integrate sort of this whole on the road of busking and fire juggling, and then sort of assimilating those sort of gifts and skills into the corporate world, and now sort of helping people to really find purpose, both in organisations and individually within those organisations. And Powered by Purpose is now published. Where can people get hold of it?
It's on the Pearson website. So that's the publisher.
How do you spell the Pearson, just to be clear for our listeners?
Thank you. It's Pearson.
And is that .com or?
I think it is.
Or you just Google Pearson and
I think
Powered by Purpose.
Yeah, you would find it there. You'll also find it on Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. So in lots of places.
Great. And people want to find out about what you're doing going forward, and then the events that you're doing, or what you're find about your work. Your website is sarahrozenthuler.com still?
It is. That's my more personal.
And then Bridgework as well.
And bridgeworkconsulting.com.
Bridgeworkconsulting.com.
Yeah, that's got more of the corporate and leadership work there. And thank you very much, Will, because I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
No, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for listening to Follow Your Blisters. If you've enjoyed this episode, please stay tuned for more lively and inspiring conversations released bi-weekly on Wednesdays on Apple Podcasts / iTunes, Spotify and other channels. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, where any reviews would be hugely appreciated. You can also find out more about this podcast on consciousfrontiers.com, where you can sign up to receive news and updates. Big thanks go to Ike Morland for editing and recording this podcast, to Michael Tyak for the music, and to GFM Radio here in Glastonbury for lending me their studio. Finally, if you have friends who you think would enjoy or benefit from this podcast, please do spread the word. Thanks a million.